The mist crept through the narrow streets like ghostly fingers, wrapping around the worn cobblestones in a cold, unrelenting embrace. The flickering streetlights cast weak, trembling shadows against the old brick buildings, their glow swallowed by the dense fog. The city was alive with distant sounds: car horns, murmured conversations, the occasional echo of hurried footsteps. But here, in this forgotten corner of town, everything felt frozen in time. A small figure walked alone, her footsteps light but deliberate. A girl, no more than 8 years old. Fragile in appearance, yet there was something about her that made people hesitate before approaching. Her golden hair peeked out from beneath a woolen hat, swaying slightly with each step. Clutched tightly in her small hands were the thick leather leashes of 5 massive German shepherds. Their fur gleamed under the dim light, their muscular bodies moving in perfect unison. They never barked, never pulled, never hesitated. It was as if they were marching to a silent command that only they could hear. The neighborhood had grown used to the sight of Isolde, Izzy, Mercer, and her dogs. Every evening, at the same time, she walked the same path with the same calm, almost ritualistic precision. Yet no one knew where she came from. No one knew where she was going. The rumors had started months ago, whispers of a little girl with haunting eyes, a girl who never spoke but always seemed to be listening. Alaric Rick Holt, a retired detective who lived on the corner of the street, had been watching her for weeks. He told himself it was just curiosity, just an old habit from years spent chasing shadows and unraveling lies. But there was something about her, something unsettling. The way she carried herself, the eerie stillness of her dogs, the way she seemed completely unafraid of the dark streets that made even grown men quicken their pace. It wasn't normal. Then, that night, something changed. As Izzy turned the corner of the street, she suddenly stopped. The dogs stopped, too, instantly, without a sound, their ears twitching in perfect sync. A shiver ran down Rick's spine. He had seen them walk this street 100 times before, but this was different. Something was watching them. He could feel it. The silence grew thick, suffocating. Then, the 5 German shepherds lifted their heads at the same time, their sharp eyes locking onto something unseen in the shadows. Izzy didn't look afraid. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, a slow, knowing smile curved at the edge of her lips, as if she had been expecting it all along. If you're as intrigued as I am by this mysterious story, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. And if you want to find out what happens next with Izzy and her enigmatic dogs, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss a single moment of this suspenseful tale. Rick had spent years chasing shadows, tracking criminals through dark alleyways, unraveling the twisted motives of liars and thieves. But as he stood at his window that night, watching the small figure of Izzy Mercer frozen at the street corner, gripping the leashes of her 5 massive dogs, a different kind of fear settled in his chest. A slow, creeping dread that made his fingers twitch against the curtain, his breath come slower, more controlled. He had seen strange things in his lifetime, but nothing like this. The girl stood impossibly still, her golden hair barely shifting in the cold wind. Her 5 German shepherds, Vako, Edda, Rune, Sig, and Kale, stood just as motionless, their eyes locked onto something beyond the streetlights. Rick followed their gaze but saw nothing. Nothing but darkness. But he felt it. A presence, thick and heavy in the air, pressing against his skin like the static before a storm. Then, just as he convinced himself it was his imagination, he heard it. A whisper. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the distant murmur of the city. It was something else. Faint, curling through the night like fingers dragging across a frozen windowpane. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like a feeling, a sound that crawled under the skin and settled deep in the bones. Rick's stomach tightened. Every instinct told him to step back, to shut the blinds, to forget he ever saw this girl and her unervingly silent dogs. But he couldn't. Izzy's grip on the leashes tightened. Slowly, she tilted her head, as if listening. Not with her ears, but with something deeper. The way she moved sent an unnatural shiver through Rick's spine. A child shouldn't be this calm. A child shouldn't be standing here, in the dead of night, staring into the darkness like she was waiting for something to answer back. Then Vako, the largest of the dogs, let out a low, rumbling growl. Not one of fear. Not one of aggression. But a warning. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. Rick swallowed hard. His pulse hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to move. He shouldn't do this, he knew that. But still, his hand found the doorknob. His feet carried him forward. The night air bit at his skin as he stepped onto the sidewalk. "Izzy," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't turn around, didn't flinch, just exhaled slowly, almost as if she had forgotten he was even there. Then, finally, she spoke. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Holt." Rick's breath stalled. The whisper in the air grew louder. And then, from the shadows, something moved. Rick had spent most of his life chasing criminals, learning to read people, their fears, their lies, their tells. But standing there on that deserted street, watching Izzy Mercer and her 5 enormous dogs, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Pure, unfiltered dread. It wasn't the girl herself, nor the unnatural discipline of the dogs that unsettled him. It was whatever lurked beyond them. Something just outside the reach of the streetlights, blending with the fog. It was watching. At first, it was nothing but a vague disturbance in the darkness, like the night itself had shifted. A ripple in the air, an outline too faint to define. Rick narrowed his eyes, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. His mind raced through the logical explanations, a trick of the light, his tired eyes playing games. But no, this was real. Something was there. And then it moved. Not like a person. Not like anything human. The motion was jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by tangled strings. It shifted, dragging itself forward and then back again, as if struggling against something unseen. Rick felt his pulse spike. He had chased down dangerous men before, murderers, drug lords, people who would slit a throat without hesitation. But this was different. This wasn't human desperation or madness. This was something else entirely. Izzy remained still, her small fingers tightening around the leashes. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even surprised. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked onto the shifting mass of darkness ahead. And then she spoke, her voice eerily calm. "They don't like being watched." Rick's stomach twisted. "They?" The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. She wasn't talking about her dogs. She was talking about whatever was standing just beyond the light. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to turn around, to pretend he hadn't seen any of this. But it was too late. Vako, the largest of the dogs, suddenly let out a low, warning growl, followed by the others. Their hackles were raised, their bodies tense, not ready to attack, but ready to hold something back. And then Rick saw it. The shadow wasn't coming closer. It was pulling away, not retreating out of fear. It was being released. And Izzy, she was letting it go. Rick's breathing was uneven now, a slow, deliberate effort to keep himself from losing control. He had seen terrible things in his life, things that left scars on a man's mind. But nothing compared to this. Nothing compared to watching a child stand, unshaken, as something unnatural retreated into the shadows. His instincts screamed at him to act, to do something. But what was he supposed to do against something he couldn't even understand? Izzy finally turned her head, just enough for him to see the edge of her face. Her expression wasn't frightened. It wasn't even concerned. It was something else entirely. A quiet knowing, like she had seen this before. Like she had done this before. Her grip on the leashes loosened, and as if on cue, the 5 German shepherds settled, their hackles smoothing, their rigid stance softening. Whatever had been there was gone. Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind clawed for logic, for an explanation. Maybe he was tired. Maybe his imagination was getting the best of him. Maybe Izzy was just a strange girl with well-trained dogs, and the shadows were nothing more than tricks of the dim streetlights. But then she spoke again. "It doesn't like to be seen for too long," she murmured. The words sent a sharp chill through Rick's spine. His fingers clenched into fists. "What the hell was that, Izzy?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, but he couldn't help it. He needed an answer. The girl didn't look at him right away. Instead, she stared into the empty darkness where the thing had been, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she turned to face him fully, her eyes catching the dim glow of the streetlights. For the first time, Rick saw something in them that unsettled him more than the shadow itself. Pity. Rick had always trusted his instincts. They had saved his life more than once. A wrong turn, a hesitation before opening a door, the way a suspect's eyes flickered right before pulling a weapon. His gut had always known when something wasn't right. And tonight? Tonight, every nerve in his body was screaming at him that something was terribly wrong. Izzy Mercer stood in front of him, no taller than his waist, holding onto the leashes of her 5 massive dogs. And yet, somehow, she was the one in control. The girl didn't fidget, didn't look away. She wasn't scared. She wasn't even curious. She just stared at him, her small fingers gripping those leather straps like she was tethering herself to something far bigger than him. Rick exhaled, forcing himself to steady his breathing. The night felt too thick, like the mist carried weight, pressing against his chest. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but logic felt useless here. He had seen something, or at least he had felt it. Something in the shadows. Something that moved wrong. Something that shouldn't have been there. "Izzy," he tried again, keeping his voice even. "Tell me what that was." For a long moment, she didn't respond. She just watched him. It was the kind of silence that made a man feel small, like she wasn't deciding whether to answer him, but rather whether he deserved to know the truth. Finally, she spoke. And when she did, it wasn't with fear. It wasn't even with hesitation. "It watches the town." Rick felt a chill settle deep in his bones. Not he. Not they. It. He let out a slow breath, glancing toward the darkness where the presence had disappeared. His brain struggled to make sense of it. A person? No. No person moved like that. An animal? Nothing in the natural world moved like that either. The way the air had changed, the way the dogs had reacted, it had felt wrong. And yet, Izzy wasn't surprised. That was the worst part of all. She wasn't surprised. "How long, Izzy?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more careful. "How long has it been watching?" She hesitated this time. Just for a second. But it was enough. Her gaze lifted to meet his, her eyes catching the weak glow of the streetlights. And then, in that same quiet, steady voice, she finally answered. "Before I was born." Rick felt the world tilt beneath him. The thing in the dark wasn't just passing through. It had always been here. Rick felt the weight of Izzy's words settle deep in his chest. "Before I was born." She had said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, that it sent a chill through him. There was no fear in her voice. No hesitation. Just quiet certainty, as if she had long since accepted a truth that no child should have to understand. That thing, whatever it was, had always been here. Watching. Waiting. The silence between them stretched. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on Rick's shoulders. The streetlights flickered weakly, their glow unable to reach the thick darkness beyond them. The dogs had relaxed, but they were still alert. Their eyes never left the empty space where the presence had disappeared. Rick forced himself to take a slow breath. Every instinct in his body told him to walk away, to pretend this conversation had never happened. But he couldn't. He had spent too many years chasing the truth to ignore the one standing right in front of him. "Izzy," he said carefully, keeping his voice low, "if it's been here for that long, then tell me, what is it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, her grip on the leashes tightened, her small knuckles turning white. And for the first time that night, Rick saw something flicker across her face. Doubt. Not fear. Not exactly. But something close. A hesitation, as if she was about to say something that she knew he wouldn't want to hear. Then, finally, she spoke. "I don't know." Rick frowned. "What do you mean you don't know? You just told me it's been here longer than you. How can you not know?" Izzy exhaled slowly, her eyes lowering to the ground for a brief moment before meeting his again. "I only know what my father told me." Rick's stomach twisted. Her father. In all the years he had lived on this street, he had never seen Izzy with anyone. Never seen anyone come or go from that old house at the end of the block. "Your father." His voice felt dry in his throat. "What did he tell you, Izzy?" She hesitated. And then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she said, "That he can't leave." Rick's pulse slowed. His breath caught. "He." Izzy shook her head. "My father." She paused, then added, "He can never leave." Rick opened his mouth, but no words came. Because for the first time, he realized something truly unsettling. He had lived on this street for years. He had seen Izzy walking the dogs, day after day. But he had never, not once, seen a man in that house. And now, she was telling him that her father was still there. Rick swallowed hard. So where was he? Rick felt an eerie, suffocating stillness settle around him. The night air was cold, but that wasn't what made the hair on his arms stand on end. It was something else. Something about the way Izzy looked at him. Calm, patient, as if waiting to see if he would figure it out on his own. That he can never leave. The words rang in his head like an alarm. They didn't make sense. If Izzy's father had been inside that house all this time, then why had Rick, or anyone, for that matter, never seen him? The neighborhood wasn't big. People noticed things. And yet, as far as he could remember, that house had always been quiet. Too quiet. Rick's pulse quickened. He had lived here for years, watched Izzy walk these dogs nearly every day. But never, not once, had he seen a light on in that house. Never heard a voice through the open windows. Never seen anyone else step foot inside or out. Just Izzy. Always Izzy. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "When was the last time you saw him?" Izzy hesitated. It was slight, just a flicker, a split second of something unreadable in her face. But it was enough. Enough to make Rick's stomach tighten. Enough to make the night feel even heavier. One of the dogs, Vaco, the largest, shifted beside her, his ears twitching as if he, too, sensed the weight in the air. Izzy's fingers curled around the leather leashes, her knuckles turning pale. Finally, she lifted her chin and looked him in the eye. "I see him every day," she said. Rick's mouth went dry. It wasn't the words themselves that unsettled him, it was the way she said them. Slowly, carefully, like she was choosing them on purpose. A slow chill crept down his spine. "Inside the house?" he pressed. Izzy nodded once. But something in her expression changed. Not fear. Not exactly. But something close. Rick exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. His mind screamed for a rational explanation. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he was bedridden. maybe. But no, that didn't explain why no one had ever seen him. And then, as if sensing his thoughts, Izzy spoke again. He doesn't like visitors. Rick's breath stalled. His skin prickled with something colder than fear. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about whether or not her father was inside that house. It was about what else might be in there with him. Rick stood there, staring at Izzy, but she wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze had drifted past him, back toward the house at the end of the street. Her house. The one with the drawn curtains, the darkened windows, the silence that stretched far too deep for a place where someone supposedly lived. Her father was inside. She had told him that. But Rick couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that statement. If her father had been in there all this time, why had no one ever seen him? Why had no one ever heard his voice? Why did Izzy always walk alone? A sharp gust of wind swept through the street, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something else, something stale. Rick exhaled, trying to keep his thoughts steady. He needed to be careful here. This wasn't an interrogation room, and Izzy wasn't some suspect trying to weasel her way out of a lie. She was a child. A strange child, yes, but a child nonetheless. And yet, the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, it was as if she knew something that no child should ever have to know. Rick took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. "Does anyone else ever come to your house, Izzy? Any family? Friends?" Her fingers tightened around the leashes. The dogs tensed, their ears flicking at his question. For a second, Rick thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, she shook her head. "No one." The word sat heavy between them. Rick let out a slow breath, glancing back at the house. It looked dead. Like an abandoned relic at the edge of town, a place time had long since forgotten. But it wasn't abandoned. Someone was in there. And then, Izzy spoke again. "Do you want to see him?" Rick's pulse skipped. The way she said it, so calm, so casual, sent ice through his veins. She was asking if he wanted to go inside. His gut twisted, every instinct screaming no. But he wasn't sure if it was because he was afraid, or because he already knew that once he crossed that threshold, nothing would ever be the same. Rick had faced plenty of difficult decisions in his life. Kick down the door or wait for backup. Pull the trigger or hesitate for one more second. Chase the suspect into the alley or let them go. He had made those choices in an instant, without fear, without doubt. But now, standing on a quiet street in the dead of night, with a little girl asking him if he wanted to step inside her house, Rick felt something he hadn't felt in years. Dread. Izzy Mercer was still watching him, her expression unreadable. The way she held the leashes of her 5 German shepherds, the way the dogs stood so still, it was as if she was waiting for something. Not his answer. Something else. Rick's gaze drifted toward the house. It was wrong. Not just eerie, not just abandoned looking. Wrong. The kind of wrong that made the air feel thicker, heavier, like an invisible weight pressing against his ribs. The curtains were drawn, just as they always had been. The porch light was out. There were no sounds from inside. No movement. But someone was in there. "Do you want to see him?" Izzy's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Rick swallowed. Every muscle in his body told him to turn around. This was not his problem. He wasn't a cop anymore. Whatever was happening inside that house was not his responsibility. And yet, his feet stayed planted on the pavement. He had spent years learning how to read people. The way their voices wavered when they were lying. The way their hands twitched when they were hiding something. But Izzy Mercer? She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't lying. She wasn't scared. She was waiting. Rick exhaled slowly. "Is he expecting me?" Izzy's lips twitched, almost like a smirk, but it was gone before he could be sure. "He knows you're here." A chill ran down Rick's spine. One of the dogs, Vaco, let out a soft, guttural sound. Not a growl. Not a warning. Just acknowledgement. Like it understood something that Rick didn't. Rick took a step closer. Then another. The air felt colder near the house. The porch steps creaked under his weight as he climbed them, his pulse hammering in his ears. Izzy followed behind him, her small footsteps barely making a sound. The dogs remained at the bottom of the steps. They weren't coming with her. Rick reached the front door. His fingers hovered over the doorknob. Something about this felt irreversible. Like the moment he stepped inside, he wouldn't be the same person when he walked back out. If he ever walked back out. Izzy was beside him now. She tilted her head slightly, watching him with something close to curiosity. Then, she lifted a hand and, without hesitation, pushed the door open. It wasn't locked. It never had been. And inside, something was waiting. Rick stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, everything changed. The cold night air vanished, replaced by something dense, almost suffocating. The house was warm, but not in a comforting way. The heat felt unnatural, like the air had been sitting still for too long, untouched, unmoved. It carried the scent of old wood, damp fabric, and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. The door behind him creaked as it slowly drifted shut. He didn't turn around to watch it close, but he heard the soft click of the latch settling into place. Something about that sound made his pulse quicken. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Not the peaceful stillness of an empty home, but a silence that felt alive. Like the walls were holding their breath. Izzy walked past him, stepping into the darkness without hesitation. Rick hesitated. His instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through years of chasing criminals, were screaming at him to turn around. To leave. But the problem was, he didn't think the house would let him. His eyes adjusted slowly. The living room stretched out to his left, a space filled with shapes of furniture he could barely make out in the dim glow from the streetlights outside. But there was no movement. No ticking clock, no hum of a refrigerator from the kitchen down the hall. Just stillness. As if nothing inside this house had moved in years. Rick cleared his throat, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Izzy, where is your father?" She stopped at the base of the staircase. For a second, she didn't answer. Then, finally, she spoke. "He's upstairs." Rick swallowed. The stairs disappeared into darkness. The hallway to the right led to the kitchen, where no light touched the walls. There were no photos on the walls, no personal touches, just a house frozen in time. Then he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The dust. Everything in this house was covered in it. The wooden floors, the furniture, the walls. A fine layer of gray, untouched for years. Except for one thing. The staircase. The steps were clean. No dust. No cobwebs. As if someone, or something, had been using them. Izzy began to climb, not waiting for him, not looking back. Her small frame disappeared into the darkness above. Rick's heart pounded. Everything in him told him to turn around, to leave this house and never look back. But his feet wouldn't move. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, upstairs, he heard it. A sound. Soft. Like breathing. And against every instinct screaming at him to run, Rick followed her up the stairs. Rick climbed the stairs carefully, his steps slow, deliberate. The old wood groaned beneath his weight, but the sound was swallowed by the thick silence that filled the house. There was something unnatural about the way the air pressed against him, heavy and unmoving, like the entire place had been sealed away from time. The deeper he moved into the house, the less it felt like somewhere people actually lived. Izzy walked ahead of him, small and silent. She didn't look back, didn't check if he was following. She simply moved forward, as if she already knew what would happen next. Rick hated that. It made his skin crawl in a way he couldn't explain. This wasn't how a child was supposed to act. No hesitation, no fear, just quiet acceptance. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into shadows. Dim light from the street outside barely reached this far. The wooden walls felt closer together, the ceiling lower than it should have been. Rick had been inside hundreds of houses throughout his career, but none of them had ever felt like this. It was as if the house itself was watching, listening. Then, he heard it again. Soft, slow, faint, but unmistakable. Breathing. Rick froze. It wasn't his own breath. It wasn't Izzy's. It came from ahead of them, from deeper in the hallway. It was the sound of someone, or something, waiting. Rick's throat tightened. He scanned the doors lining the hall. All of them were closed. The wood looked untouched, their handles coated in a thin layer of dust. Except one. At the very end of the hallway, slightly separated from the others, stood a door that was different. The handle was brass, worn smooth from years of use. Unlike the others, it wasn't covered in dust. The wood was dark, polished. It stood there like it had been waiting for someone to finally notice it. Rick's voice was lower now, almost a whisper. "Izzy, where is he?" She stopped walking. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed. The last door on the left. Rick swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Something about that door felt different. It wasn't just shut, it was sealed. It held something behind it. Something that wasn't meant to come out. Izzy turned her head slightly, finally meeting his gaze. Her voice was quiet, steady. "He's awake." Rick barely had time to process her words before it happened. From the other side of the door, something moved. Not footsteps. Not the shifting of fabric or furniture. Something heavier. Something breathing. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob twisted. Rick felt his stomach drop. It wasn't fast. It was slow, deliberate, like whatever was on the other side wanted them to know it was coming. The brass handle creaked as it turned, the old metal grinding softly in the silence. Every instinct in Rick's body screamed at him to move, to grab Izzy and pull her away from that door. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because Izzy wasn't moving. She wasn't afraid. She just stood there, her face calm, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the leashes of the 5 dogs waiting at the base of the stairs. Rick stole a quick glance at them. They weren't growling. They weren't barking. But their ears were pinned back, their bodies stiff with tension. They were waiting. The latch clicked. The door shifted. And then it opened, just an inch. Rick's pulse pounded against his ribs. The gap was small, but enough to see inside. Or rather, not see. Because there was nothing but blackness. Not shadows. Not dim light. Just black. Rick swallowed hard. The hallway was dark, but not that dark. His eyes should have adjusted by now. He should have been able to make out something. A bed, a dresser, the vague outline of furniture. But there was nothing. Only an endless, suffocating void. The air changed. Something inside the room shifted. Rick didn't hear footsteps. He didn't hear fabric rustling or the creak of furniture moving. But he felt it. A presence. Large. Aware. Watching. Rick clenched his jaw, forcing himself to speak. "Izzy." His voice was hoarse. Tight. "Where is your father?" Izzy turned her head slightly toward him. In the faint light of the hallway, her expression was unreadable. Then, slowly, She looked back at the door and said, "He's here." Rick's breath stalled. She hadn't said inside. She had said here. A slow chill crawled down his spine. His entire body screamed at him to run, to turn around, to leave this house and never look back. But his feet stayed rooted to the floor. Then, from inside the room, the breathing got louder. Deep, slow, heavy. Like something massive was just beyond the doorway. Sitting. Waiting. Rick's fingers twitched. He should reach for something. His phone, a weapon, anything. But his hands stayed frozen at his sides. His body wasn't listening to him anymore. Then the blackness inside the room shifted. Not the kind of movement that comes from a person stepping forward. This was deeper. Like the air itself was rearranging. Like something vast was pushing itself closer. And then, for the first time, Rick saw something. Eyes. Not glowing. Not reflecting the light. Just two blacker-than-black voids staring at him from the darkness. His breath caught. Then the door, asterisk asterisk on its own, asterisk asterisk began to open wider. The door swung open. Rick's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't supposed to open like that. Not slowly, not quietly, but smoothly, effortlessly, as if something inside had been waiting for this exact moment. The darkness inside didn't just sit there, it moved. It stretched outward, curling along the edges of the frame, creeping onto the hallway floor. It wasn't mist, wasn't shadow. It was something else. Something alive. Then he saw them again. The eyes. Not glowing, not reflecting light, just there. Two voids, deeper than the blackness that surrounded them. Rick had seen dead bodies before. He had seen eyes emptied of life, drained of everything that once made them human. But this was worse. Because these weren't empty. These were full of something. Something that watched. His pulse pounded in his ears. Every nerve in his body told him to move, to back away, to run, but he couldn't. His muscles locked, his breathing shallow. He had never felt fear like this before. Not when he had faced men with guns, not when he had been in situations where his life was at risk. Because those had been threats he could fight. This was something else. The air around him felt thick, pressing against his skin like static before a lightning strike. The thing inside the room exhaled, and the sound crawled over Rick's flesh. It was slow, deliberate, too controlled to be human. Then, from beside him, Izzy finally moved. She took a single step forward. Not afraid. Not hesitant. Like she had done this 100 times before. Like she belonged there. Rick's breath was shaky. "Izzy," he managed, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. She just stared. Her small frame looked impossibly still in the dim light of the hallway, the faint glow from outside barely outlining her silhouette. She was completely calm. Rick swallowed, forcing his body to respond, forcing himself to think through the thick fog of fear wrapping around his mind. He had been in dark rooms before. He had been in crime scenes, in places where the worst of humanity left its mark. But this wasn't human. The thing in the room shifted again. Not stepping closer, not moving toward him, but changing. The air crackled, a weight pressing down on his chest. The shadows weren't just filling the room anymore. They were breathing. Rick clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had to move. He had to break this spell, had to pull Izzy away, but she wasn't leaving. She tilted her head slightly, still looking at the darkness. Then, in a voice so soft it barely reached him, she spoke. "He's looking at you too." Rick felt the breath leave his lungs. Because as soon as she said it, the eyes blinked. Rick took a step back. It wasn't a conscious decision. His body moved on its own, pulling him away from the thing in the darkness, from the eyes that had just blinked. But it didn't matter. Distance meant nothing here. The hallway, the floor beneath him, even the very air around him, all of it felt wrong. Like he was standing inside something's mouth. Izzy remained where she was, her posture still, her expression unreadable. She wasn't scared. She wasn't even tense. And that terrified Rick more than anything. The air in the room thickened, pressing against his skin. The darkness wasn't just blackness anymore. It was shifting, twisting, moving in ways that made no sense. Not like smoke. Not like mist. Like something deeper, something heavier, was trying to take shape. Then it breathed again. The sound was low, too steady, too aware. Rick's mouth went dry. His fingers twitched at his sides, muscles coiled with tension. He should run. He should grab Izzy and get out of this house, out of this street, out of whatever nightmare he had stepped into. But he couldn't move. Because now, the thing inside the room was moving. Not stepping forward. Not walking. But shifting. Expanding. The darkness itself unfurled, stretching, spilling further into the hallway. The air around them seemed to warp, bending with it, as if space itself was folding in on something that shouldn't exist. And then, a hand emerged. Rick's breath stalled in his throat. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But there it was, long, unnaturally thin fingers stretching from the blackness. The shape was human, but wrong. The proportions were off, the joints too sharp, the skin too smooth, like something trying to mimic a body but failing. The fingers twitched, moved. Rick stumbled back another step, his heart hammering. And that was when Izzy finally spoke. "He knows you now." Rick turned to her sharply, pulse pounding in his ears. "What did you just say?" Izzy finally met his gaze. Her expression wasn't blank anymore. There was something behind her eyes, not fear, but understanding. Acceptance. And then, behind him, the thing took another breath. Deep, slow, like it had lungs. Like it was preparing to speak. Rick's stomach twisted. He didn't want to hear it. Whatever this thing had to say, he didn't want to hear it. And yet, as the darkness continued to stretch toward him, he knew. It was already too late. Rick felt the blood drain from his face. The fingers stretching from the darkness were too long, the joints too sharp, bending at angles that no human hand should. It wasn't reaching for him, not yet. It was simply testing, feeling, like a creature that had been trapped in the dark for too long, slowly remembering what movement was. The breath in the room deepened, slow, deliberate. Rick could hear it, could feel it, not just in his ears, but in his chest, vibrating inside him like a pressure building from the inside out. And then, the worst thing happened. It spoke. At first, it wasn't a word. It was just a sound, low, distant, something ancient pressing against the air itself. The walls of the house seemed to shudder, as if reacting to its voice. The wooden floor beneath Rick's feet creaked, not from his weight, but from something shifting deep within the house. Then he heard it. Rick. His breath stalled. His name. It had said his name. Not in a whisper, not in a way that echoed from the walls, but directly into his head. The voice didn't come from the room. It came from inside him. Rick staggered back, but his legs felt heavy, like they had sunk an inch into the floor. He had spent years chasing men, standing face to face with murderers, feeling the cold weight of a gun in his hands. But nothing had ever felt like this. This wasn't fear. This was recognition. Behind him, Izzy exhaled. The sound was soft, almost resigned, like she had been waiting for this moment. Rick turned his head just enough to see her standing in the dim hallway, her face half lit by the faint glow from outside. She wasn't watching the thing in the dark anymore. She was watching him. Rick forced his voice out, though it barely sounded like his own. "What is this?" Izzy's fingers clenched slightly around the leashes. The dogs were motionless. Their fur bristled, their eyes locked on the darkness in the doorway, but they didn't growl. They didn't bark. They knew. Finally, Izzy spoke. And when she did, her voice was quiet, almost sad. "You shouldn't have come inside." The air turned colder. Rick's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to step back, wanted to move, but his body wasn't listening anymore. Then, from inside the room, the thing moved again. And this time, it stepped forward. Rick wanted to run. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to turn around, to sprint down the stairs, to escape this house and never look back. But he couldn't. The air around him felt dense, pressing against his skin like an invisible weight. It was as if the walls had grown tighter, the space around him shrinking with every second. His feet felt rooted to the floor, not by fear alone, but by something else. Something unseen. And then, the thing inside the room moved again. It wasn't a step. Not something as simple as that. The darkness itself seemed to shift, contracting and stretching at the same time, like space inside the room was warping around something vast. Rick had spent years facing dangerous men, but nothing had ever made him feel like this. The sound that followed wasn't a whisper, wasn't a growl. It was something wet, something dragging. Like flesh pulling against wood. Rick's stomach twisted. He didn't want to see it. He knew, with every instinct in his body, that looking at this thing was a mistake. But it was too late. It began to emerge. First, the fingers, too long, too thin, bending in ways that made Rick's breath catch. Then, a hand, or something that had learned how to imitate a hand but hadn't gotten it quite right. The skin wasn't real skin. It was too smooth, too thin, shifting over something underneath, like fabric stretched too tightly over moving parts. Rick swallowed hard. The rest of it started to take shape. But this wasn't like seeing a person step out from the shadows. This was like watching the darkness itself take form. And as it did, Rick realized the worst thing of all. This thing wasn't just coming toward him. It had always been here. Rick could hear his own heartbeat pounding against his skull. Too fast, too loud, too real. The thing in the dark wasn't stepping forward like a person. It wasn't walking at all. It was spilling into the hallway, its shape stretching and folding in ways that made Rick's stomach twist. It wasn't just moving, it was changing. The hand had been just the beginning. Now, more of it slipped into view. An arm too thin, too long, bending at a sharp angle. The joints didn't move like they should have. The skin, asterisk asterisk if it even was skin, asterisk asterisk was smooth, too smooth, shifting like stretched fabric over something that pulsed underneath. It wasn't human. It was only trying to be. Rick felt sweat slide down the back of his neck. The air inside the house was suffocating now. Thick, heavy, pressing against his chest. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that had wrapped itself around his thoughts, around his very presence. Something was pulling him closer. And then the eyes appeared again. Two black voids in the darkness, but this time they were closer. They weren't just looking at him. They were looking into him. Rick tried to move, to take a step back, but his body didn't respond. His mind was screaming at him to run, but his muscles refused to obey. His breath came shallow, controlled only by force of will. Something wasn't right. Something in the air had shifted, and then it spoke. The sound didn't belong to this world. Rick had expected something guttural, something monstrous, but this was worse. It was deep, distorted, pressing against his ribs, inside his skull, inside his thoughts. And it said his name. Rick. The moment he heard it, something changed. The house around him seemed to tilt, just slightly, like the ground beneath his feet had become unstable. His vision wavered. His stomach twisted. He had the sickening feeling that something inside him had shifted, not physically, but something deeper. It had spoken to him. No, it had recognized him. Izzy exhaled softly beside him. The sound barely reached his ears, but it was there. Like she had been waiting for this. Rick turned his head toward her, his movements slow and strained. She wasn't watching the thing in the dark anymore. She was watching him, and her eyes weren't blank anymore. They were sad. Rick's throat was dry when he finally forced out the words. "What is this?" Izzy didn't answer right away. Her fingers twitched around the leashes. The dogs, ***, motionless, tense, ***, stood completely still. Not growling, not barking, not warning. They knew. Finally, Izzy spoke. And when she did, it wasn't a warning. It was a truth. "You shouldn't have come inside." Rick's pulse slammed against his ribs. His body was stiff, unresponsive. He needed to move, to do something. And then, from inside the dark, the thing moved again. And this time, it stepped forward. Rick felt the air around him shift, pressing against his skin like something thick, heavy, almost liquid. The house no longer felt like just a house. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling, they all felt wrong, like they weren't just part of the structure but part of something else. Something deeper. Something alive. The thing inside the dark wasn't just stepping forward anymore. It was unfolding. Its limbs stretched and twisted, bending in ways that defied everything Rick understood about movement, about anatomy. One moment, it seemed tall, impossibly thin, its arms reaching outward. The next, it was hunched low, its form contracting, reshaping itself as if testing different versions of reality. The darkness around it rippled, shifting with it, bending in response to its presence. And then it stopped. Not because it was hesitating. Because it had found what it wanted. Rick's stomach twisted. The eyes, those bottomless black voids, were locked onto him. He had seen terrible things in his life, had stood over bodies, had stared into the vacant eyes of men who had taken their last breath. But this was different. This wasn't the stare of something empty. This was the stare of something aware. Something that knew him. His instincts screamed at him to move, to turn around, to escape. But something kept him frozen. Not just fear, something deeper. It was as if the air itself had thickened around his limbs, weighing him down, keeping him in place. Like the house itself didn't want him to leave. And then the voice came again. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a growl. It was something deeper than sound, something that pressed against his ribs and wrapped around his spine. It didn't come from the thing's mouth. It came from everywhere. From the walls. From the air. From inside him. And then, in that impossible voice, it spoke his name. Rick. The moment the word reached his ears, the world shifted. The house seemed to tilt, just slightly, like the ground beneath his feet was no longer stable. His vision wavered, his thoughts blurred. He felt it, something deep inside him twisting, changing. This wasn't just sound. This was recognition. Then, from the corner of his vision, Izzy exhaled. Rick turned to her, his breath coming sharp and fast. She wasn't watching the thing in the dark anymore. She was watching him. And in her face, he finally saw the truth. She had known. She had always known. This wasn't an accident. He hadn't stumbled into this. He had been led here. Rick's jaw clenched, his voice rough. What is this? But Izzy didn't answer, because at that moment, the thing inside the dark smiled. Rick's body no longer felt like his own. Something was wrong. Not just with the air, not just with the house, with him. The pressure that had been pressing against his skin, against his chest, wasn't just suffocating anymore. It was sinking in, crawling beneath his flesh like invisible fingers, wrapping around his ribs, pressing into his skull. Something was changing. And the thing in the dark knew it. Rick could feel it watching him, those hollow, bottomless eyes locked onto his very existence. It wasn't just looking at him, it was looking into him, through him, like it was searching for something it already knew was there. His vision wavered. The wooden floor beneath his feet didn't feel solid anymore. Everything around him was shifting, warping at the edges, as if the walls weren't just walls but something thinner, something more fragile than it should be. And then Izzy spoke. Her voice was calm, steady. She wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid. "You feel it now, don't you?" Rick's stomach twisted. She wasn't asking. She was stating a fact, because she already knew. His hands curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. She knew something he didn't, but he could feel it now, like an itch inside his skull, a memory clawing its way to the surface. Something he wasn't supposed to remember. Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could barely force the words out. "What is this?" Izzy tilted her head slightly, still watching him, studying him. Her gaze was knowing, expectant. And then she said something that made his breath catch in his throat. "You already know." The words hit him like a hammer. And the moment she said them, something inside him snapped. A wave of dizziness slammed into Rick so hard his knees nearly buckled. The world didn't just tilt, it collapsed inward. He reached out blindly, grabbing the doorframe to keep himself steady, but it didn't help. Because the feeling wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from inside him. Memories that weren't memories. Flashes of things he had never seen, but somehow recognized. Voices speaking in words that didn't exist. A darkness stretching back further than time itself. Rick squeezed his eyes shut, his breath coming fast, shallow. No, this wasn't real. But deep down, he knew the truth. It had always been real. Then, from deep within the house, the thing took another step forward. And this time, Rick felt it move inside him too. Rick couldn't breathe. The air around him wasn't just heavy, it was alive. Something unseen pressed against his skin, wrapped around his bones, sinking into him like it was trying to pull him out of himself. The fear he felt wasn't just instinct. It was deeper, older. A recognition that came from a place he couldn't reach. The thing in the dark wasn't just watching him. It was welcoming him back. Rick stumbled, his vision blurring at the edges. The wooden floor beneath his feet felt wrong. Soft, shifting, as if the house itself was breathing with him. His legs trembled, his mind reeled. He tried to fight it, to hold on to something real, something solid. But the hallway, the walls, even time itself, everything was unraveling. And then he heard them. Whispers. First one, then another. Not loud, not even words at first. Just soft vibrations in the air. But somehow he understood them. "Rick, we know you. You are home." Rick clenched his jaw, trying to block it out. Trying to hold on to himself. But there was no himself anymore. He turned, desperate for a single moment of clarity, and saw Izzy. She wasn't afraid. She never had been. Her face was calm, almost gentle, but her eyes told him everything. She knew. She had always known. And that was when it hit him. This wasn't an accident. He hadn't just stumbled into this. He had been brought here. His breath came ragged, his throat dry. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "What is this?" Izzy tilted her head slightly, never breaking eye contact. She didn't need to answer right away, because he already knew. But still, she said it. You never left. The floor groaned beneath him. The walls seemed to stretch. The entire house trembled with a soundless force, as if something inside had finally awakened. Rick fell to his knees, his fingers digging into the wood as if he could hold onto something real. But there was nothing real anymore. The thing in the dark stepped forward. And Rick remembered. Not a life. Not a moment. Everything. The truth hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't a stranger here. He had never been a visitor. He was part of the house. Izzy knelt beside him, her small hand resting lightly on his arm. "It's okay, Rick," she whispered. "You're home now." Rick gasped, his body convulsing. He fought it, one last, desperate second of resistance. But there was no point. He let go. The thing in the dark took its final step. And Rick opened his eyes. The real ones. The ones he had forgotten. And then, there was no Rick anymore. Only the house. Only the thing. Only the truth.